So I know some of you were able to see a film that was a sort of representation of some of the material that Joan worked with, very sort of complex sequence of productions, both in film and in drawing, in performance work, spoken word, you could say, that we saw a sort of short film that encapsulated this. We're going to have rolling, I hope, somebody can roll it for me, a sequence of images that are taken from both what was a performance called Moving Off the Land and a large installation that was then installed in Venice last summer that related to the same material, but it
re-edited and expanded.
Exactly. So Joan, given that we've got limited amount of time, I thought just to begin at the beginning, maybe you can talk about where this work originated and what the inspiration was. And
well, I think originally in my piece in Venice for the American Pavilion, I was dealing with issues of the environment, and I was inspired by an Icelandic writer who writes very poetically about nature. And so he had a quote about bees, and so it kind of was a segue into that piece. And I had a room about bees and then a room about fish, because I had done a project of drawings of fish that I thought of on the way to Japan, where so many fish are consumed. Because I often think, what's going to happen? You know, but anyway. So there was this section about the sea, and then Último Bauer, who was the curator for TBA 21, invited me to do a performance in that context about the oceans. And so then I focused, that's how it began. And and I began, the first performance was in Kochi, India, which was a great place to begin. Outdoors, and it was wonderful. The village square, which was all dirt, and there were local people in the audience. It was perfect. You know, we didn't perform in a tucked away colonial mansion, which we could have, but so that was
in the landscape. It's such a rich body of material that you brought into this project. I mean, it includes both your own film footage that you worked with a marine biologist, references to Jean Pain films, to many different works of literature from Moby Dick. Calvino appears, and the amazing Rachel Carson as well. Can you speak a little bit about the way in which you've kind of brought those materials together and how that, I mean, I sort of always imagine you surrounded by this kind of incredible richness of materials, but how do you then begin to structure work like this?
It's very accumulative. I mean, actually, this whole obsession or interest in the ocean began at MIT. I'd seen these photographs of creatures in the dark, you know, under the sea, and they're so amazing looking. And so I had a class at MIT called Archaeology of the Deep Sea Action. And so I had my students do projects. It was their research relating to the deep sea. And so it's all been a continuation of that. And I worked with Moby Dick. I had them read Moby Dick because it's a classic American book about how we slaughtered the whales and the oil industry began. Yeah. So it's an cumulative process, beginning with a certain amount of material and then adding and subtracting. I began with Jean Pain with his wonderful footage, and then I didn't use it later on, and so on. And then Rachel Carson came in later when I was enlarging the work and adding more text. I think she's one of the most important writers about the environment and what's happening, because she's not just a scientist, she's a poet, really. Her writing is beautiful, the way she uses metaphors to describe like a sponge being a huge cavernous, like a medieval castle. The sponges, the little snails are moving through with their claws. You know, so she makes a picture so you understand. Anyway.
And then perhaps this relationship between the performance and the installation. I mean, as you're moving, the installation itself was extremely immersive, but it also has this rather so many different platforms that you work with, I suppose, which is very particular attribute of your work, both from a more ephemeral, provisional kind of placement of material, but then also a very you've always really pioneered the way in which we encounter moving image, from these very personal spaces to more immersive environments. But perhaps you can talk a bit about the process of realizing the installation from that material.
Well, the performance is still the same. I'm going to do it in Madrid, and the show is going to be at the Tysons Museum, and we're doing the performance. The performance is as it has always been structurally. with a big background, which I've been working with. I call it parallel narrative. And I work in that image, and you see that a little bit yesterday with me running with the seals. And so the installation is, there's a composer, Ikue Mori, who played the music. And then when I began to work on the installation, I re-edit, and I don't include a lot of things that are in the performance. I don't include myself speaking as a commentator on the image. It's much more of a, and I brought children into it. They weren't in the original performances. And so I thought, with the same children that I worked with for the Venice Biennale, who are all children of friends of mine, and I brought them back into it. Now they're all, it was 2 years, I think 2 years later, they're all, the girls are young women, and the boys are bigger. And I thought, the minute they came to my studio, I actually didn't know what I was going to do with them. I said, they have to speak this time. And so I brought them into it in that process. And I really like the children, because the same thing in the Venice Biennale, to have the children voices included in this dialogue about our future and our environment, because they're the ones who are going to inherit it. And it wasn't didactic. I didn't tell the children, what is happening, why am I doing this? Because I didn't want them to be depressed. But my main idea in that regard was to show how miraculous these creatures are that are being lost.
I remember we had a conversation some months ago, probably leading up to this, and I remember you remarking, Joan, that in the late 60s, early 70s, that you and the other artists that you were working with at that time really weren't engaged with the ecology movement.
I know, I saw that question, and I was wondering how I was going to answer it. Because, no, I think that we were all aware of it, but it wasn't in our work. Smithson was the one that spoke about it. I mean, he was a friend of mine. I mean, but he didn't see it in a romantic way at all, as you know. So it was quite a different point of view, which I had to get used to at the time. Because I had a very romantic view about nature as something that existed, actually. Smithson was more realistic about, well, he saw the beauty in industrial landscape, abandoned coal mines and so on, which do have a beauty. But so I think it wasn't in our work as content directly.
Technology has always played such an important role in your work, and I suppose thinking about resources as we are talking about them now, I feel like you've been a very early adopter, and that it's also formed your work in a way. You're not afraid to sort of continue to keep moving with it. Maybe you can talk a bit about what role media plays in your work, and sort of how you think about that.
Well, I wanted to say one more thing about the installation. It was in this amazing space in San Lorenzo, which is the TBA 21 place. Anyway, it was a beautiful space. So space is a big issue in my work, in my installations, and in my video works. And so I thought of, how do I deal with this space, and how do I separate the different images and the sounds? So that was the reason for building these boxes. And I thought just now, oh my God, they're so big and unecological. But I like the idea of having sculptural objects. Anyway, so what did you ask me? Sorry.
I was thinking more about the role of technology in your work. And
Well, I began with the mirror, which was also inspired by Borges' writings, short stories. He mentions mirrors a lot. And so I began with the mirror. That was my first prop, and I got the idea from Borges. And the mirror is a kind of technology, and it's a reflective surface. It multiplies. And the minute the video cameras came out, which was in the late 60s, early 70s, I got one because it just seemed the logical next place to go. And I was very interested in film. I'd studied film on my own for years, and I just wanted to make films, actually. So I got a video camera and began to work with it like many people did in relation to myself, sitting in front of it. That was a major moment for so many artists to see themselves live in front of a video. You can't imagine what that was, that moment. It was really something. So so for me, the idea was always to transform the image, to alter the image. And so first it was the mirror that altered the image, then it was the video camera that, you put the image through the camera, it's altered. I mean, this is just part of it. And then the deep landscape space alters the image. Everything looks flat. You don't see diagonal lines. You see everything is flat. So anyway, it has a lot to do with manipulating space, manipulating the image, and seeing the body in relation to this technology. So technology has played a major part in all of this work, which one doesn't mention, but it's part of the development of all the ideas put into the technology. It alters the ideas and the texts. And how do you translate a narrative into a video, into the time-based medium, into an installation, or into a single-channel video?
And now, I mean, of course, this installation and work has this extraordinary layering process, which again is sort of something that's I see it as the way in which you've used drawing or layers of materials, and suddenly the film itself is becoming this kind of incredible
Well, that was what interested me about early, when I first started working with video and performance, that you could have two things going on at the same time. Or you could have the live thing and see it projected at the same time, so that people have to put all these things together. And it's actually the way our minds work now. And the computer has influenced the way our minds work. So from then, I've always been interested in how to make layers and put more than one thing, several things together to complicate it. It's like you're listening to one thing and seeing another thing. We do that all the time. So.
I want to talk a bit more about landscape. Although obviously this work has a very specific seascape that sort of appears in and out. When I think about your work, even the very early performance pieces are often taking place in an urban environment and in a sort of a somewhat uncontrollable environment, which is very different, I think, to a lot of the work that was being made at that time, which was usually in the studio or in a sort of defined space. And of course, Cape Breton and Nova Scotia, where you spend a great deal of time in the summer, has been an important site for you as well. Maybe you can talk about sort of both working in the landscape and what that landscape has meant for you, cityscape,
Well, I grew
landscape.
up going to the mountains in the summers in New Hampshire, so looking at the mountains and being in the landscape and loving it. And so when I went to, it's a double thing. So first of all, I was very aware of what the land art people were doing, because I was a friend of Smithson's and we knew Heiser and so on. And I went out, I don't know if it was before or after I started doing that piece in downtown. I saw double negative and Smithson's piece before he did the drawing. Anyway, so that was in the air for sure. But we all, a bunch of us went to Nova Scotia and got places. And it's just natural for me to go out in the landscape, because I love it. I don't have a way of theoretically talking about it, but it's just it's my environment that I'm interested in. And it's more beautiful than, and also inspiring a different way. There's a spirit, I do think spirits inhabit the landscape. And I'm very interested in ghost stories and old stories. So all of those reasons, the landscape has memories and ghosts, which I interact with in a way. And so also, when I started doing performance, I did a lot of research about other cultures' rituals. And a lot of rituals take place in the landscape. Most. And the No Theater, for instance, had a huge influence on me, began as a ritual. And some of the plays are outdoors in the landscape. So for all those reasons, many reasons, the landscape.
Did it ever occur to you to want to mark the landscape in any way, to make a permanent gesture?
I wish I'd thought of it then. Now I think, oh my God, yes.
And just because you mentioned it, Joan, I'm interested to hear, because we've been talking about this now for a day or so. You just mentioned sort of having anxiety now, looking at your projections. Is the use of resources something that you think about within the studio, and the sort of movement of materials or the use of materials?
I work mostly with paper, so it doesn't take up too much room. I do a lot of drawings, and I keep thinking I want to do something like an object. Well, I do make objects, sort of, in my installations. But, I do think about it, yes. And especially today, I was thinking, oh my God, what can I do? In relation to this. It's a big issue. And what I mostly worry about is all the cardboard that Amazon sends out, that's in, you know, the packages that we get, tons of cardboard that people just throw out in the street. So I do think about it, but I don't know what I do about it yet.
Thank you.